USA Network podcast. I'm Megan Villalpando, and I'm here with Jim Sparks.
Hello.
And Abraham Guevara.
How's it going?
And in today's episode, we want to dedicate some time to getting to know our new Chief Secretary and Territorial Secretary for Women's Ministries, Colonels Kelly and Donna Igleheart. Colonels, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Megan, for having us.
We're really excited. In this episode, we're going to get to know the Iglehearts in a little bit more detail. The Iglehearts have jumped right into their new roles at THQ and are pretty busy, but they were very gracious and they took the time to chat with us today because, as you soon will learn, they are both very pastoral and they care deeply about youth ministry. But before we get into our conversation, we want to take a minute, as always, and share a youth culture resource with you. So, Jim, what do you have?
Well, you should have warned them, first of all, that they've got a beautiful Southern accents. It sounds so much better. Southern accent. So we're going to talk about the Dodgers-Braves divisional series first. No, there's nothing to talk about. Dodgers won. And
Can I have a war breakout here?
What's a Dodger?
I'm still excited. No, I know that they're wearing their hats. We're good. The first, if we have time, I'm going to get to two. I'm going to break a rule here and get to two. But the first one I thought was kind of fun. And my kid is got a year and a half away from this. But last week, everyone knows that it was National Teen Driver Safety Week. Everyone, I'm sure you guys celebrated that and shared cards with your family members. And the article is kind of funny because it was talking about how they're encouraging parents to practice what they preach, and before they learn their teenagers learn to drive. And looking back, I remember being confused when I was learning to drive. I'm like, that's not what they do. That's not what they do. And it was different. And then, because I think different levels, I started thinking about this is a good metaphor for a lot of things. Like parents do weird things for one, like especially with the young kids, they go say hi to your friends at the grocery store. Like go say hi. And if like our parents are like told us as adults to go say hi to our friends that we knew, we're like, no, I'm not going to go say hi to them. I'm wearing this, or I'm hiding from people. Like we do hypocritical things a lot as parents, but you guys have kids that learn to drive under your watch.
We do. We have 3 adult daughters now who have children of their own.
There you go. Did you model good driving behavior prior to teaching them to drive?
Well, let me begin by answering that question for her, Donna. She's an excellent driver. She has never had one single ticket.
Wow.
And
that would be a correct statement.
It is not that she didn't get caught. It's that she's that safe of a driver.
Wow.
Yeah, so she should have been the model. Now, I'll let her share the rest of the story.
I would agree with you on that, although we kind of left the driving instructions, or I did, to him, because even though I'm probably more cautious and adhere to the speed limit and those kind of things, when it came to teaching the children to drive, he was the go-to for that. And I would have kept them on side streets for months. The first time he took them out driving, it was on a major interstate. And so I didn't know that, though, until he came back, and they were a little surprised that Dad would do that. But
I'm a believer in the deep end.
Yep.
And so why play around in the shallow?
Just rip the Band-Aid off.
yes,
Exactly, Megan, exactly.
yeah,
Did all of them pass on their first shot?
they did.
They did.
Wow.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Well, I take no credit. They're very good drivers to this very day. And if any of them have had a ticket or an accident, they've not shared that with their parents.
I think 2 are more cautious drivers. One may be a little bit more like you. I'm just saying.
Which means fast.
Yeah.
I
do
maybe.
I do like to get from point A to point B without wasting time.
And I help him.
Do you have
that.
an invisible brake that you use?
Yes, and hitting the side of the door and just
have
help. I
bruises.
consider myself, I'm a helper. It's part of my gifting just to be a helper. And so on occasion in the car, I might remind him there's someone on that's coming over in our lane, and that the horn does, it does have a function and you can use it. But he doesn't seem to do that.
Do you get your hand in there in the horn every now and then?
No,
if
I
you
wouldn't
forget
do
to-
that.
Okay.
No, she
I like
respects-
still being married to him, so I wouldn't do that.
She respects her side of the car.
Okay, very good.
But in South Africa, I was the primary driver. We had one vehicle, so for 5 years, I was that person dodging cows and other people on the road. You were 10 times more likely to die on the roads in South Africa than you are in the U.S.
Wow.
Wow.
And so caution was the watchword, and I think I was a little more careful, just observant, particularly of pedestrians.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think the girls, they're pretty good drivers to this day.
It was interesting. You'd think the younger of the three would be maybe more anxious and to get her license, but she wasn't. She really felt the responsibility of, behind that wheel.
I think that's part of that's very common now. Like when growing up, people at 16, you got your license, or 17 at the latest.
Exactly.
I think I got mine at 17. But now a lot of them wait. Part of it in California, at least, is there's so many different laws attached until you turn 18 that a lot of them will just wait it out and not have to drive till then. And then some of it is the generation of parents actually being involved and driving them everywhere instead of making you ride your bike everywhere, which I was in better shape, but
I think there's been a reduction in people getting their licenses, right?
Yeah.
And young people.
yeah, I've got friends with kids that their kids are like,
Yeah,
not
she
really
was
interested.
going off to college, and we said, "You must get your license. I want to see you, so
Yeah.
you'll have to come home." And
But I think there's so many more distractions today for young drivers who aren't accustomed to driving, and the risk that's there, which is compounded with your phones and other devices, and suddenly you're distracted, and so I appreciate the fact that they want to mature a little bit before they really launch out on their own and drive.
plus there's this lie. It's a lie. It's just an outright lie that you get more freedom when you get your license when you're a young driver. You think, all right, when I get this license, I got a lot more freedom. No, you have to do far more work because now you have to go to the store for things. Now you have to go drive your sibling somewhere. It's worth it to not, as far as I'm concerned.
And it's fun at first, oh, Mom, you need more bread or milk or whatever. And then, after a while, you're like, oh, really?
No, it's brutal.
Yeah.
I've only had one ticket. Abraham, where are you at?
I'm like at 4 or 5.
All right, you're winning so far. Megan,
Probably about 3 or 4. But
how many
to
have
be
you
fair-
should have
Now, to
had?
be fair, well, really quick, I did live in Long Beach for a time, and Long Beach is notorious for parking tickets. But then I probably should have had 6 or 7.
Man,
I've earned
I've been
every
very
single one of
lucky.
those tickets, and I'm proud of it. No, I'm not proud.
My loan ticket came in Hawaii, and I deserved it. I was going the speed limit of California at 65, and it was 55, and I got a ticket for that. And then the guy, I wasn't even paying attention, and I was driving my normal speed. I'm not a super fast driver, and he pulls me over and he goes, "I'm really sorry." And I go, "That's fine." I thought I would get out of it because I was driving a Salvation Army car. I'm from California.
Oh, I've had that thought
I
before.
I thought I had everything, and he didn't
No.
even care. So he gives me the ticket, and he goes, "This is how much it costs at the bottom of it." And in California, a 10 mile and over would be like $200 to $300 or something like that.
Probably.
Wow.
And so he goes, "It's $100." It was like $105 to ticket. I go, "What?" And he goes, "I'm really sorry. We just raised the price of the tickets and stuff like that." I go, "No. This is
You
this
should've
is way
gone with it.
cheaper
You
than I
should've
would have
gone
had
with
to
it.
deal
Like,
with at
oh.
home." I go, "You did me a favor."
It's gonna bring hardship to me.
I know. So it's weird. But yes, be careful with modeling good behavior for your kids,
Absolutely.
not just for driving, but for everything, because what we talked a little bit about before, the teaching is it's already happened before you get there. It's just the mechanical things that you have to teach, like starting the vehicle, the accelerator, and the brake. But the mentality and all that stuff is already there. And so, as parents of young kids, especially to model that, you tell your kid to go say hello to someone, you better be ready to go say hello to someone as well. But go ahead, Abraham.
I just feel like there's so many bad drivers. I just need to let them know while I'm driving, and sometimes my kids are there. So
I have a habit of waving at people when I drive. Like when people get really angry at me, I just like a nice soft wave and smile at them. It turns out it's not always welcomed.
No.
But my kids love it. They think it's the best.
I removed all the Christian bumper stickers from my car, so there's no confusion.
There is no Salvation Army emblem, icon, sticker.
Nothing. Took it all off.
I'm ashamed of that. But.
Some of the craziest drivers do have like a little fish on their car, like.
I will tell you, a family member of mine, I won't say their name, is an officer, retired officer, that was driving home from commissioning in the 12-passenger van and got pulled over because the van was weaving in the lanes. That's just how he drove. And the cop did a DUI test in his uniform, in his outfit, in front of the 12-passenger van with a bunch of home league ladies sitting in the van. He was clean. He was good. He got away and stuff. But they had a good laugh with that story.
Yeah. I'm the driver that, if you went over and to change lanes, I'm just going to let you do that.
Got it.
I'm going to accommodate anyone as much as I can.
If the exit is coming up like in 2 miles, Donna gets over right then.
Yeah.
I wait till about,
a second.
Yeah. Just when it's necessary, then you exit.
Yeah.
That is my husband. 100%.
I'm right there with you.
I don't see the problem. You know
don't
what?
either.
Here's the things. They call them bumpers for a reason.
Exactly. Oh my
And
God.
everybody has brakes.
Yeah.
So what's the problem?
Oh, that's
This
terrible.
man
Not everyone
thinks
uses them.
clearly. I love it.
Yeah. My problem is if I do anything wrong, my kids immediately report it. Like there's like an immediate reporting
Oh,
of it.
I like that.
And so I wasn't paying attention, and I'm like, oh, gosh, I got to get off here, and whipped over and got off. No problem. Mom, you should have saw Dad out there. I was like, you did not see me. Like, we drove for 30 minutes. 29 and a half of those minutes were perfect.
Well, Jim, there's an obvious lesson you didn't learn. It has nothing to do with driving. It has to do with bribing.
Bribing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very
Why
true.
they sell Snickers and all kinds of great, McDonald's.
Oh, we're bad parents. We don't give them candy.
Oh,
That's what's so funny about like Halloween. They're like, Dad, look, my kids like. So a few of our neighbors put together those chutes where you could shoot the candy down, social distancing. Great. Well, because there were so few kids, my kids came home with like 10 pounds of candy. They only went to like 10 houses,
Wow.
and they're all excited. They have yet to realize they're 9, 11, 14 that they only get to eat candy maybe like once a week. Like, so that candy just lives in there for the adults for the rest of the year. They have not figured that out yet.
but that's why you send children out to trick or treat. It's not for them. It's
Right.
for us.
It is.
Amen.
You don't like that, do you? It has nuts in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mom and Dad.
Well,
will
my
take-
daughter has a peanut allergy, so that works out
Oh,
in our
that's
favor.
It's terrible.
I'm sorry.
I mean,
but
yes, it's really bad. Sorry.
I can feel it.
I'll be sure to give her EpiPens when
it'd be much
she
better.
trick or treats at my house next time.
All right. Well, Colonels, thank you once again for being with us. We want to just get to know you guys a little bit more. So I'm going to just start off from the beginning. How did God sort of develop this calling in your life to want to serve in full-time ministry? I love origin stories. It's always like super fascinating to me.
And I will say that origin stories is probably the most common questions we get asked as youth leaders. We get asked, I don't know about you, Megan or Abraham, I get asked all the time how I fell in love with my wife. How did I know that I was in love? And when we decided to get married? That question gets all the time. And it started originally with like older groups that were starting to think about that stuff. But it gets like teenagers ask it right away. They want to know the origin story.
Yeah, I think some of my favorite movies are like origin
Those are the best
story.
superhero
Like,
movies.
yeah, like I think those are better than sometimes like subsequent films and
Yeah.
stuff. But yeah, how did God sort of develop this calling in your life to want to serve in full time ministry? And specifically, I'm curious too. Was this something that you guys saw yourself doing? Was being officers, or were you maybe a little hesitant, or what was kind of like the beginning for you guys?
Thank you, Megan. It's quite an easy answer for me. I was born and raised in the Salvation Army. It was my life. I mean, we were in at the core. My parents, for 50 some years, held significant local officer leadership positions. Actually, my father was unchurched, and he was invited to the Salvation Army, and he saw this beautiful 23-year-old Sunday school teacher, and that day he decided he liked church. And so he
That
started.
makes perfect sense.
Yes, yes.
It works.
And we have a similar story with that as well. But um, all my life, as a junior soldier to corps cadets, and I had local officers and corps officers, and of course, the most loving parents who just spoke into my life. And I saw beautiful, joy-filled officers living life and investing in the young people in the Corps. And we had like a very thriving um, YPL, I believe was what we called it back then. And I mean, you just couldn't wait to get to the Corps. And so that was just really instilled in me, and they believed in me, and they gave me so many opportunities. I saw something which I think is so important for our young people. Often we can just see the beautiful core in front of us, but the Salvation Army is so much wider and broader than what is even in front of us. And so we are big believers in giving young people opportunities to see a greater army. And so at a youth councils when I was 14, I remember sitting there with my peers, and just really, I can't remember what the message was on actually, but I just remember the Lord just really impressing upon me that day, I need you. The world needs your voice. The world needs for you to love and serve. And I stood up, and, my friends were like, what in the world, And so I just made my way to that altar, and there was never a point after that I didn't know how God would work it out because I was still so young, but I knew that He would.
Hmm.
And I never looked back. And those that I went to, students I went to high school with, friends, and I was in marching band and chorus and chamber choir and all that, they all knew. Even when I was 14, 15 years old, my eyes were set.
Hmm.
My heart was set on being a Salvation Army officer. It was nothing that I ever dreaded, or there were days when I was like, Lord, I'm not sure how you're going to work this out, but I trust you that you will. And so I never turned back. And I was even questioned at times by, you'll never leave the Salvation Army, will you? By friends. And I said, no, I'm called to be a Salvation Army officer. And, you think at age 14, really? Particularly today,
Right.
when I believe our young people are really searching, and they seem to be a little more short term. I'll do this for a while, and then I'll go and try this, and I don't have a problem with that. But for me, it was my eyes and my heart were set from that moment on, and I just never looked for anything else.
So I love that story. It is not my story, but I wish it were. My story, we met when we were 16, and like her father before her, I saw a beautiful young lady who went to a different high school. We grew up in an area in the western part of Kentucky. It's a little place called Owensboro. It's about 50,000 people. And I grew up about 20 miles outside of the city on a farm. And so we met through a mutual friend, and I immediately began thinking, okay, this is a girl I need to date, right? And a lot of our listeners, particularly our young listeners out there, you're probably saying the same thing. You've probably seen that person. You think, that's the person I'd like to get to know better. Well, in order for me to, because we went to two different high schools, we lived far away from each other. The only way we could get to know each other better was for me to attend this thing called the Salvation Army. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Well, the Salvation Army was obviously an odd duck for me. I barely even remember seeing them ring the bells in those days in this little town. But I soon found myself at the Salvation Army, and I drove my car around the back, so none of my friends, of course, would see me. I didn't want to be affiliated with a church, and particularly the Salvation Army Church. But soon as I walked in, I found that the local officers and soldiers and people who attended the Corps were so welcoming. They didn't need to know my history or my experience. They only needed for me to come and be a part of that family. And immediately I was welcomed in, really as a stranger. And probably to some people in that Corps and across that division, I was an enemy because I was sneaking in and finding myself connected to an honored junior soldier, a graduate corps cadet, the eye of the division. That's who I was stealing away from all these young men. And so
Goodness.
I quickly got engrafted into the Salvation Army, even though some people may not have wanted me to. And I'll tell you one of my favorite stories. We went to a local pizza parlor kind of thing, restaurant. And I was sitting there, and I was still not yet, I was BC, right? It was before Christ. And so I was sitting there at this table, and I used a language that the church people didn't use. I don't know if any of our listeners are like that. I hope not, but maybe you were at one point. And I used a word that was not appropriate in that setting. And a friend across the table, you could, all of a sudden the conversation stopped. And it was like the whole restaurant stopped talking when this word came out of my mouth. And this guy across the table, who was a soldier at the Army, another young person, looked at me, and he kind of put his hand across the table and said, "Hey, that's okay." And I was accepted. Even though I was not a part of that culture, I was readily accepted, as I communicated before. So if you fast forward quite a few years, we at some point in our young days got married and started careers and families and all those things. But there was that hungering for me. I knew that she was called, though she never pressured it. It never really came. It was not that secret prayer that I would hear at the dinner table, or, there was no covert way of her coming in and making me feel guilty. But it was that soft, subtle way of being there to support me, knowing that her calling was sure and the Lord would not bring us together unequally yoked. And she just waited patiently. And I went to those youth councils and men's weekends and all those territorial events. And I would be, maybe like some of our listeners, that guy who the major came up and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't you feel like you're called? Don't you need to go forward? You need to respond." And I don't know how many times that happened. And I understood what they were saying, and I was not upset about that. I was never put off about that. I appreciated the fact that they saw something in me that I couldn't see for myself. But generally speaking, it was, well, when God calls me, right, the answer is going to be yes. I was at that point. The answer is yes. Lord, just point me in the right direction for that career, for whatever it might be. So eventually, at a Christmas that I'll never forget, that crisis moment, we had friends who from the same Corps had gone to training, and they came back for their Christmas break. And so we went and had a dinner with them. And this guy said this quote, or quoted me this thing that I'd heard probably 50 times. And it was, "If you don't go, who will? If you don't go, who will?" Now, I'd heard that before. But for whatever reason, it's like the Lord got my attention with that one. For some reason, I think I was ready to hear it in a new way. The Holy Spirit brought that closer to my heart than ever before. And I began to kind of ponder that. I began to kind of question and wonder. And so for me, we began talking more openly about this call to officership. And we were always willing, but I just never felt called. Now I'm 27, 28 years of age at this point. We have a house, actually 2 mortgages. We have 2 cars, 2 dogs, and whatever it is, the American dream. We had that at 28.
Children as well.
Yeah.
Along with the dog.
Two children.
Could have started with that.
Don't forget them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and the kids. I forgot.
We had dogs
Yeah.
and
I hope
neighbor's
I
cat.
hope they're not listening to this recording. But so anyway, there was no reason for me to go. There was nothing I was abandoning because the Lord had blessed us with whatever. But through that conversation and through some time that transpired, we began, for me, a part of the response to the calling confirmed the calling. A bolt of lightning never came, a brick out of the heavens never appeared. It was that subtle, soft 1 Kings, I was in the wind approach to the calling for me. And we thought, okay, I'll put out the fleece. And the fleece actually had a physical appearance. It's called an application. I don't know if you remember this FOF thing. Fellowship of the Future Fellowship of Officers, or whatever that's called. I should know. Future Officers Fellowship. I thought, okay, I'll fill out this form. It's a simple 1-page thing. It doesn't really mean anything. I'm not committing to anything. I'm not going to Afghanistan or any place. And so I filled out the form. We filled out the forms. And like within seconds, it felt like we got these letters. Congratulations, you're now a member of the FOF. Okay, that's cool. And then we thought, well, okay, so I'll put the fleece out on this side. And that side was the application, the initial application you might fill out to become an officer. Okay, they're obviously not going to accept us. And so what's the risk? I'll just say, okay, Lord, make it rain right here. And so we filled out those applications. And within a week, probably, would you agree? Very soon after that, we received a phone call from the DYS, who was a friend and still a friend. He says, hey, I got your application. I want to come and talk to you. So we drove 2 hours. We have this thing about pizza. It was another pizza place. And we sat down and talked. And it started this confirmation process. Long story short, through the process, the Lord kept confirming this is the right thing. This is the right direction. And we sold our house. We sold used cars that I made money on, the things, the stuff in life that was kind of important, but not greatly important. The Lord just began eliminating those things and making the pathway smooth. And through that, I would say he confirmed that calling that Donna had in her life at 14, God placed in my life about 27, 28, but it was that unknown calling. I think I'm called, I'm not sure. So let's try it. I don't want to say that I was testing God. I wanted to say, Lord, I'm willing. I'll take a step in faith. And if this is the right way to go, you'll put a stone down there for me to walk on. And then step after step, he placed that there until we ended up at the training college with 2 children and 1 on the way at that time. And 2 years went by quickly. And next thing you know, we're officers. And to this very day, I've never once thought about exiting or jettisoning my calling. To this very day, I'm so excited every single day to get up and go about the mission of the Salvation Army. To this very day, I know the Army isn't perfect, but you know what? I want to do the best I can to make it. I have to question, am I rebelling or am I a reformer? And I want to be part of the reformer. I know it's not perfect, but I want to make it that way. And on my watch, I want to win as many people to Christ as I can, to disciple people, to engage people, because I know what it feels like to wander. Not always in sin, but in that unknown area where, gosh, what is it God wants me to be? what is it God wants me to do? I know exactly how that feels, and I know the joy it brought to my life when I, in faith, walked that direction. And I love to see it when people respond to whatever that calling is. Jim, for you, it's youth ministry here in the Territory, right?
Mhm.
I think you just said before we came on, you're celebrating like 17 years in your current position. See, your ministry and my ministry are exactly the same. There's no difference. In fact, your ministry may be broader than mine because you have a different impact. You have a different congregation. And the Lord uses us all in those things. I happen to be called as an officer, but that doesn't minimize anybody else's calling.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for our young people to hear and our not so young people and the way we deal with young people. Just let's get everybody saved. Let's get everybody going on some kind of discipleship process. And some that's slower than others. That's okay. And then let's find out together, what is it God wants you to do or be as an adult and as you grow in that relationship with him.
Thank you, honey. I just I want to go just a little bit deeper in one area of what you've just talked about, and that was the moment. Now, just put yourself in that place of here are two soldiers in a corps in Kentucky, where on occasion someone from divisional headquarters might come for a visit.
Those people
Yeah.
at headquarters.
But as I recall, I don't even think a week went by. I believe it was the day, by post, by mail, that our application hit the desk of the divisional youth leader, the DYS, that we got a call. I want to come and see you. I was like, are you kidding? That you would drive 2.5 hours to come and take us to dinner, because he was like, I see value in these two. And I don't want any time to lapse between this hitting my desk and a conversation. And that really spoke volumes to us. And I will just say, Colonel Eddie Hobgood, I mean, he oversaw the Boundless Congress. I mean, that was that guy who saw something in us and
It was Captain Hobgood.
He was captain then, yeah. I'm going to go talk to these two and just really speak into their lives. And we've never forgotten that. And another side note of Kelly's, his testimony that really has spoken into our journey as officers is to take a risk on your young people. That corps in Owensboro, Kentucky, could have easily seen Kelly as a risk, but they didn't. They saw him as an opportunity, and they just leaned in. And so that's what we have tried to do throughout our officership as corps officers, as divisional youth leaders, as territorial youth leaders, and serving even abroad, to be able to say, Lord, just point us into the direction of that young person, and who needs it the most, that we can call out that gifting within them, that they can know that we see them. Not only that we see them, but God sees them and can use them. Because what if someone or that corps had just said, Kelly he's on church, and he's trying to date this, our girl, and but they didn't. They did just the opposite. And that's just kind of the community that we came out of, that has really, that time at the table, at those pizza places and those youth councils and those camps, and we worked at camp together, and just that whole journey where people saw us, and it just really instilled in our hearts and our minds that you have to be intentional about seeing young people, and our eyes are always fixed on the ones that perhaps others would never look at.
Can I come in there, because that's a critical piece, and I love the fringes. I love the people who hang there, because that was me,
Mm.
right? I identified quickly with that group. And in general, my experience has demonstrated to me about 10% of our youth are always going to be the straight A. They're going to show up for everything, and they're going to, help and clean up the core, and they're the perfect, right? I'm not that person. There's another 10% that's probably polar opposite of that. The troublemaker, the one that's going to just cause problems in your youth group, who's not going to be consistent, who might even, take something that doesn't belong to them, or leave the empty trash in the van, or whatever you want to call them. And then, though, there's the 80%. That 80% is the critical mass. That's where I would have probably fit in. The 80% that you don't see. They're right in front of you, but they don't get your attention. The perfect child and the one who struggled, that's who demand your attention. I'm the 80% guy. And so I would encourage our youth workers just to pay attention to that group, because they may be a little quiet in your youth group. They may not get all the answers just right. They're going to be pretty faithful, right? And they're going to kind of do what you tell them to. They're going to come across as not a rising star or shiny and perfect, but that's the majority of us, and that certainly identifies me. And I appreciate the fact that Sunday school teacher, I hadn't gone to church in years, and one of the first Sundays I went to the Salvation Army Sunday School, which was a big risk for me to go to a Sunday school because I didn't know the Bible. I didn't know the right words. I certainly didn't know what a captain was, or a blue uniform. And at some point, the Sunday school teacher, her name was Martha. To this day, I can remember exactly, in that old library in the basement Sunday school class.
That's where they put kids' Sunday school.
Yeah, and they should, because you can't destroy the walls. But I was a teenager, and there came that moment when it was time to open your Bibles, and the fear, right? The fear that comes over. Might find Genesis. And she asked people to open their Bibles. You know what she didn't do? She didn't ask me to do anything. She didn't ask me to read. She didn't ask me to pray. She didn't ask me to open or do anything. I just got to blend in. And that's the 80%ers. They just blend in. And I would just say, pay attention to those 80%ers, because those are the ones who end up, I think, from personal experience, making a difference. And not that the other 20%ers, 10%ers aren't important. They desperately are. But pay attention to where your attention goes to, and just include that group in the middle, because that was me. I was never going to raise my hand. I was not going to do anything particular well, but I was pretty faithful. And eventually, over the years, the Lord taught me a lot of things about the Salvation Army, and as a young person growing up. And Donna referenced early in the recording YPL, that's Young People's Legion. I don't think it exists anymore.
We still call it YPL, but let's be honest, Young People's Legion sounds like a disease of some sort.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like some movie that Mel Gibson might produce.
It's either magnificent or gross. So either way, it's not a good descriptor of what it is.
But at the end of the day, it was a group of teenagers who just got together, typically on a Friday night, right, and hung out. And there, and then later in the men's group and all these things, people began putting me in some leadership positions that I wasn't equipped for, but I began learning that I actually could lead a group of people. I didn't have it I wasn't trained for that. I had no experience with that. But I began kind of uncovering brick by brick this gifting that God had given to me. And he allowed that to come to fruition really as a young person at the Salvation Army, where I came in with basically very little Christian experience. I grew up in the church as a boy, but I'd walked away from that. And the Salvation Army gave me opportunity locally at the divisional events, at territorial events, and people began seeing something in me that I myself couldn't see. And they gave us opportunity. And I think that goes back to Donna's comment, and probably why we did it. Even to this day, we take risk. Calculated, yes. I'm not going to bring a young person someplace and not pay attention to them. In fact, I'm going to be closer to them because I want to get to know them, and I want them to get to know me. And and not necessarily me, but who this Jesus is that I love and serve. And if they can just grab a hold of that, and we could probably go back now, 30 years later, and pick and give you names of all these young people who God ended up using in some amazing way. Some of those people became officers. Some of those people are now serving faithfully in their corps or even in other churches. And you know what? Some seem to have fallen between the cracks. And those are the ones that concern me. And those are the ones that keep me up at night a little bit. My missed opportunities. And what could I have done better? What could I have demonstrated more about Christ's love or given another opportunity? And I have to go to sleep at night, knowing, okay, God, I did try to do my best. Maybe that wasn't enough, but Lord, just bring somebody else right into their lives. Let somebody else breathe into them hope and future. And yeah.
So you guys, you have different kind of paths to your callings, different sort of timeline, but it all comes together. You guys enter into training school and you finish training school. What are some of the places that your ministry has taken you since then?
Well, before you go to training, you have psychological testings and a lot of tests. And I remember being with the doctor who kind of gave us our kind of synopsis of where he thought maybe our first appointment should be. And he said, they come from a smaller community and city, and so I wouldn't necessarily put them in like a inner city. That was exactly where we went. It was in Louisville, Kentucky, and we had a big boys and girls club in a community where
let's say it was in a place in the city where the Salvation Army desperately needed to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the lighthouse, so to speak, in that community. And that's exactly where the Army and the Lord placed us. And for 5 years. And even at the end of 5 years, I was not ready to leave. But we loved that appointment and the people there. And we were from Kentucky, and we went back to Kentucky. But in a community and a relationship of people that we didn't know. And I had no idea what Boys and Girls Clubs of America was. But yet all of a sudden I was in charge. I didn't know how to operate a senior citizens program, but every week 100 people showed up. Thank God for Donna, who had giftings with those kind of things. And so, so Kentucky was our first. Then we went to this place. What was it called? Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Now, it's 50 miles from the Gulf Coast. And we went to a community that we actually probably was more naturally fit for. It was a smaller rural community, but the Salvation Army was like the big fish in a small pond there. The Army had been there for many years, and actually a donor anonymously had given the Salvation Army about $20 million.
Ooh.
So what do you do with $20 million, right?
I have ideas.
Yeah, and we did, and eventually built a campus of buildings for youth and youth workers and Big Boys and Girls Club. We ended up opening up 5 of those over 5 years. And because we saw the youth in these communities who desperately needed, you know what they needed? Opportunity. Because no one else would give them opportunity, but you know where they got that? At the Salvation Army. And sure enough, these kids would develop. And the interesting thing, and this is not a promotional plug for Boys and Girls Club, but it's because it's in our history, we quickly connected that to the core, which is why you do these external things. That's why you have shelters, right? That's why you want to connect them to a faith-based community, and the core is the perfect fit for that. And so we quickly would have kids coming to the core, or we'd have our people would go over to the club and imagine that church people at the Salvation Army going over to one of our programs, which I greatly encourage all of our listeners to consider. If you're not doing that, I know during COVID days it's not maybe possible, but anytime you can as a part of the church, be sure you get out into those social service programs that we operate. We would do that, and we saw a lot of fruit from that, didn't we, hon?
Yes.
This is kind of a side note, but we actually sent a service corps team from our territory to the south. We swapped teams, and they went to Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
Oh,
It was
really?
kind of random. They loved it.
Really?
They loved it.
Yes.
They
Well,
think
I
they
know
spent a
why.
couple weeks there.
It's a
Ah.
lovely
Yeah.
community.
That's
Yeah.
not what they said in debriefing.
I don't know what team you were to brief.
Yeah, it's a beautiful community.
And very different culture as well, and which culture for us is pretty significant. As you can imagine, just returning from almost 5 years in South Africa. But all throughout our journey, the Lord was really preparing our hearts for that journey to South Africa. And for me, I believe in our welcome to the West. I spoke about it at my parents' table, where the poor were welcomed to. Actually, when a commissioner was coming through town, I had 3 siblings. We were all officers. It was just a corps that just raised up, and it was just
It was a nurturing corps,
Yes.
where people.
many officers have come out of this little tiny corps. But so if a commissioner was coming by, they would call and, "Hey, Mary and Harold, my parents, I'm in town," and Mother would say, "Come over for dinner." And so after the Sunday salvation meetings at that time, corps officers and soldiers would come to our house, and yet there would be times when the poor would be sitting, at our table, and people who didn't look like us but everyone was welcomed. And that really was the beginning. The Lord was just preparing my heart. I am going to place you one day in this beautiful part of the world where culture is going to become very significant for you. And so that's what the Lord does. He starts, preparing our heart for the next journey. And so culture for us is significant. We believe that you must sit with the suffering to really and to hear their stories. If we don't share each other's stories, I might see you, Jim, or both of you, or all 3 of you, but I might have this perception of you. You might have this perception of me, but until we sit down and I can hear your story and I can hear your heart, it's only then that I really know who Jim is, and you know who I am.
So that's a big part of who you guys are, and I've gotten to know you guys a little bit throughout. You guys are very much people, and but when you get into like headquarters roles, which you guys have been DYSs, program secretaries, and all that. You don't have a congregation. You're missing out on that. How do you feel that? I mean, that's a big part of who you guys are, and by traveling and going around and not having the time to spend at length to do that kind of stuff, how do you guys do that? How do you manage that?
Well, that sometimes when I think about it, we've been on headquarters for 18 years. There's often someone will go to headquarters and then they'll return back to a corps, which
Right.
I think is probably an ideal situation. We never had that opportunity. I will admit, there have been times when I've sensed loss, because I don't think there's anything really greater than being in your own community and walking life with your people, being an advocate for your young people, being there, help them to share their voice, and being there when babies are born, and holding hands when a loved one is passing, being promoted to glory. That is the ultimate, is just our heart. And so after this long of serving on headquarters, I believe it was really, we had been divisional youth leaders and then territorial youth leaders, and then we come to program secretaries. And it was at that point, because when you're in youth ministry, I'm like, okay, we have the DYs,
Right.
and we have our staff. We had a big staff in the South, and I can still see my congregation, and it's not the same as Corps officer, but I still see it. But as program secretaries, I remember sitting at my desk that first week and just talking actually to my daughter. Our daughters really speak into our lives. And our youngest daughter said, "Mom, your congregation is wherever you are. There's, 200 and some people at Territorial headquarters.
Right.
There's officers in the field who need your voice of encouragement." And it really just kind of, at that moment, I don't want to say, I did really kind of accept, okay, I'm not sure what the future will look like. Will I ever get to go back to a Corps? And maybe there's still days I wonder that. But wherever I am, the Lord will give me who He'll just place that congregation in front of me. He'll place people on my path. And that is really often our prayer.
Mm.
Lord, just we just surrendered that, actually, Jim.
Mm.
That is something that we fully trust. I mean, one thing that we can say is God can be trusted with our lives. And so I will have to admit there have been days in our journey where I have sensed loss of community and having kind of your own people. And then I had to remind myself, wherever I am, even coming into, we probably don't have time to talk about us coming back from South Africa. And we both read a book that first week we were given by THQ saying, "Can you read this for people repatriating back into their home territory? Is it still applicable?" And it talked about being in a third culture. Now, these different cultures, like the first culture is all that you knew.
Mm.
So for us, the Southern Territory. And then the second culture, the Southern Africa Territory. And the third culture, where you are now. And you'll never be the first and nor the second, but all that combined.
Mm.
But for us, I put that book down and I said, but this is not our third culture. We're going into another culture, another territory that we don't know, people we don't know. Geographically, we don't really, we know the states, but,
Right.
So I've really kind of had to just really lean into the Lord and trust Him that wherever we are, He's not a God of confusion. He's not a God who makes mistakes. He places us exactly where we need to be. I know He has us in His heart and in His mind, but also for those people that He has put in front of us.
Mm.
If it's here at Territorial headquarters, when we're able to go out in this territory and to meet the beautiful soldiers, the youth workers, the officers, then we're okay with that. And you have to settle that in your heart, I believe.
Yeah.
Particularly, some of our greatest heroes, no doubt, are the Corps officers and youth leaders who are called to community, and they're able to walk with their young people where they are. But to just really honor them and people who retire as Corps officers after 40 and 50 years,
Right.
where we've had such varying appointments, but they have steadied the course. They've stayed there in those hard days. And so we just have such a great appreciation and so appreciative to those who journey with their young people for many, many years and are so faithful in their calling where they are.
You guys were both youth leaders, and you consider yourself still youth leaders, non-retired, non completely active youth leaders. What is the part of youth ministry that you guys miss the most? Because I truly do. I do hear people say, "Oh, I'm always a youth leader," but it doesn't. That's not always the case. It's nice to say, but I genuinely think that you guys are. What is it that you miss the most of youth ministry? Because not being directly in the weeds of youth ministry on a daily basis, what do you miss most about that?
I think one, the day-to-day interaction with youth and keeping contemporary. Uh, the farther you get away from youth ministry, it seems like the farther you get away out of contemporary life.
Yeah.
What are they listening to? What's interesting? What's going on? There's a whole culture that we are too distant from at this 59 years of age now, and I miss that. I know it's there, but I don't know how to get there without connecting right
Right.
regularly to a youth. And I say youth, that could be middle school, teenager, that age group. I miss that. I think from a ministry standpoint, probably the thing I enjoyed the most, which might translate that I missed the most, was our yearly event that we would do called Territorial Youth Institute.
Hmm.
We would do it at the end of the summer, so you're talking about 200 or 300 really young adults. The average age was 19, and it typically was some of the youth workers who had spent the summer at camp, working with young people at camp, and before they went back to school or before they started their careers or whatever it was, we had that week or so to spend with them. And that probably was some of the best days of my ministry. It was 24 hours a day, but it was at a pivotal point. This particular group were Salvationists, so that was a bridge we didn't have to cross. We knew kind of what we believed, and we worked through little things like is it praise and worship or brass band, or is it tattoos or no, or whatever. And especially I remember those late nights with young people, and probably the leading question, which we've kind of started with earlier, was I would discover that the 90%, 80 to 90% of the young people gathered there, I'm not talking about the counselors or the officers, obviously, their first and their biggest unanswered question was, what is God's plan for me? Without question, you walk up to 8 out of 10 people. That was the reason they're there. They're trying to figure out. The answer was yes. The question was what? And boy, that resonated obviously with my story.
Hmm.
And so I could immediately come in and just talk to them, not direction. I'm not telling you what. I just want to coach. Coach asks questions. They don't tell. And so you just listen to the young person, their passions, and being able for them not just to connect to their future as far as career or whatever, but also that it rang true as well in their spiritual life, because they were beginning to find their own identity in Christ. It was no longer what my core cadet teacher said or my Sunday school teacher or my parents. It's now I'm standing on my own feet off at the university that may not be Christian, and I have to be able to defend my faith or those things that I believe in. And often we would feel like the perfect child, that 10%, that graduate core cadet, could go off to a university and not be able to, not just to defend their faith, but could be swayed into other religions even, or out of their faith altogether. And there was that passion and desire to anchor them, to give them a place to stand. And that, of course, is in their own relationship with Christ. And that was the moment for the year for me that I probably loved the most. Second to it, and I'll be brief and I'll hand it to you, hon, was youth workers. We would have an annual youth workers event down in Florida for a week. And so this is a different crowd, right? This is some of the people that's listening to this podcast. This is the people like Abraham and Megan that I'm sitting here with today, as well as Jim, who now are giving back, right? Somebody planted into your lives. Now it's time to give back. And how can we equip them? Culturally, are they in tune? Do they have the skill set? You know, when those tough questions come from their youth, are they equipped to answer those? Or maybe it's okay to say, I don't know. You know, I don't know the answer. I want to journey with you through this loss, through this heartbreak of boyfriend, girlfriend, or they're trying to find their identity, not just in Christ, but how they are self-identifying. You know, the culture's changed a lot in
Right.
recent years. And how do you respond to that? So that was always a great time for me as well. So that's probably what I would say. I don't know if you would have extra to say.
No, I'll use your line. I totally agree with you on that. Kelly has a beautiful story. I don't know that we have time to share, but if we could, I just think it would be a nice way to close unless you have
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, we'd love to. We're going to have this be our direct message time. So Colonel Kelly is going to just spend a couple minutes giving a direct message straight to your inbox.
Okay. So recently, Donna was, I don't know if it was a video or what she was listening to, but she began hearing this story. This preacher was telling a story in closing. And sadly, it was a story that I should have known, but I did not know. And the story centered around a tragedy. And the tragedy has a name. It actually was a ship. And the ship was called the Empress of Ireland. And the story is on May 29th, 1914. Now, that's been a few years ago, right? Over 100 years ago. And if you know your history, this is now 2 years after the sinking of the Titanic. There were 1,475 people on board this ship that was steaming out of a river, actually in Canada, and it was headed toward England. And on this ship of 1,475 people, there were 150 Salvationists from the Canada Territory. And these 150 Salvationists were actually part of a band and other groups who were sailing to England for a large Salvation Army Congress, a gathering, an international Congress, actually. And on their first evening, the ship had entered into the channel, and everyone had had their dinner. It was beautiful. The Salvationists, by the way, in those days were all in uniform on the ship. And
Always appropriate.
Always appropriate. And they were having a great time, but as people went to bed later that evening, a fog set in, and there was a collision. And the collision, unfortunately, was terrible. In fact, the ship, the Empress, sank in 14 minutes, which meant that people certainly were shocked that this happened, and then most did not have time really to respond. And so only 397 people survived that collision, 397 out of 1,475. And out of the 150 Salvationists, 124 lost their lives on that dark night in that cold river in Canada. And fortunately, for many of those cabins, the Salvationists could not necessarily afford the nice luxury places, and so they were strategically positioned in the lower parts of the ship's belly. And some of those were actually located near storage rooms where they would have life vests. And so when the ship was struck by another one and it began to sink, the Salvationists, many of them were blessed to be close near life vest. And so they began collecting those and getting those. In fact, there's also a story told of a group of those bandsmen playing on the top of that ship in just a few short minutes. Well, sadly, many of those Salvationists lost their life. In fact, the Territorial leadership all went down on that tragic night on May 29th, 1914. And sometime later, a group of people gathered to recount that night and to see and reconnect with survivors. But just before I get there, let me just remind the listeners that those survivors, those 26 survivors, went on, by the way, and got on another ship, went on to England, and arrived at that International Congress. And one of the leaders of that meeting had one of those who survived come up and tell that story. And of course, it was one of the stories that would make such a difference in that Congress, and even to this day. But after that, annually, a group of people would meet. And at the first meeting, they began telling each other stories. And this particular older man was sharing his story. And his story was that a young Salvationist, now this was a young person.
Young girl.
Yeah, a young lady, a Sally, gave her life vest away. And the story is that she was asking each person if they knew the Lord. And one older man took the vest from the young girl. And he later felt guilty about that. Here was an older man who took this vest, life vest, from this young lady who obviously was not going to be able to survive. And so he returned that life vest. And she asked him if he knew the Lord. And he responded with no. And she said, well, do you want to? And he said no. And she gave that life vest back and said, I'll die better than you. And she threw it back. And that night, he says, I was saved twice. Wow. And that beautiful illustration for Donna and I today, as you listen, is that as a young person or even as a young youth leader, we want our lives to count. We want your life to matter. That was my story as a young person. And I believe today that you want your life to matter as well. And whether you're working with young people or you're still a young person, ask yourself, how can my life matter? And that matters in the hands of God when you share your faith openly with young people and you bring them along on that faith journey. And Don and I just want to express our appreciation to the listeners today, not just for listening and enduring these stories, but for caring enough about young people to make your life matter and their life matter. Pass it on, pay it forward, and keep giving opportunity. And that may cause you to pass your life vest off to another. Maybe not physically, but maybe emotionally or in some other way. So I want to thank you for doing that. And we appreciate the time that we've had today with Megan and Abraham and Jim. Thank you for the privilege we have and the ministry that you conduct through these simple podcasts, but also the many other ways that you give. I believe it makes a difference. And so I'm thankful today for the Salvation Army, for the opportunities we've been given and the responsibilities that we have to pass it on.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Colonels, those are really encouraging. Just thank you for your words, just words of encouragement and affirmation. And I'm sure everyone who listens will be blessed. Thank you also just for being here. If you are listening right now and you have questions or thoughts on this episode, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. You can send us a message on social media at Say Network or email us at sayconnect@gmail.com. Anything we've talked about in this episode will be linked below in the show notes. Hopefully, maybe we can get a copy of the story and we can link that somehow. Abraham can work his magic and link it in the show notes. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Say Network podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube for updates on new episodes. And thanks you guys for listening. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode.